Today we're going to be talking about the circular saw. Now, when you think about a circular saw, you may not think of it as a precision woodworking tool, but with the right accessories and a few circular saw tweaks, it can really be a valuable asset in your shop, and more importantly, it's an inexpensive way to start woodworking. I do want to take some time to thank our sponsor, Craig Tool. We're going to be using a few of their cutting accessories over the course of this video. But before we talk about cutting anything, let's talk a little bit about the circular saw. So this is my circular saw, and I use it for all kinds of stuff around the house. As you can see, I've actually been using it for some light demolition. The blade in here is kind of torched. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you've got the right blade for the right job. We're going to be cutting plywood today, so we've got our ultra high tooth count crosscut blade for plywood. This is going to leave us with a nice crisp edge. So go ahead and change that out on the saw. Make sure your saw is unplugged or you've removed the battery before you start touching the blade. There's usually a wrench on board that you can use to loosen the blade. There's also a little stop on here. Just take that out. Swap out the blade. You'll also want to make sure that it's going in the right direction. Most blades, the logo should be facing out. Put that in there. And then we'll tighten that up. Go. Put your wrench back on the saw so it's there for when you need it next time. And then also, before we put the battery in, we want to talk about depth of cut. So your circular saw, you can adjust how deep it cuts. And for most materials, you really just want to go a little bit past the depth of the material. So I like to set that over here on the edge of the plywood. And so you can see that we're maybe a little too far. So we'll set the depth of cut just like so. So that means as we're cutting through the plywood, we're really just cutting a little bit into our sacrificial surface. And the sacrificial surface we're using here is 2-inch rigid foam. It's really great to have one of these in your shop because you can work on the floor with it on your plywood or on sawhorses, and it supports things while you're cutting it. So now that we've got our saw set up, our depth of cut set, we can throw the battery in and then do some measurements. So it would be great if every sheet of plywood came out of the factory perfectly square. Unfortunately, that's hardly ever the case. So I've got my square here, and I'm just going to check the edges of my plywood for how square or not square they are. Yeah, and this one isn't close to square. So we're going to give ourselves a little bit of extra length so we can come back and square up our cuts after the fact. Now we're going to be building a shop cabinet that we want to be at 36 inches tall when all said and done, countertop of about 1.5 inches. So our cabinet sides, that's the first thing we're going to cut, need to be 34.5 inches tall. Because we don't have a square edge on the bottom here, I'm going to give myself a little bit of room, call that 35 inches, and make my first layout mark here. So I'm just measuring from the end of the plywood and up in my line here at 35. Then I can bring my square in, snug up to there, and just give myself a good reference line. And then I'm going to come over to the other side and do the same thing. So this is the Craig straight edge guide, and the general gist of it is you can clamp it to your workpiece, push your circular saw along the side of it, get a nice straight cut. A couple of cool things about the straight cut guide that Craig has designed. One, you've got a spring-loaded action, so this end kind of free floats, and you just pull back to lock it in place, like so. Next, you can see these bars hanging off the side, and they do have a purpose. And that purpose is these are offset cut guides. Now, if you were to align your straight cutting guide right on your line, your saw line would actually be quite a bit away from that. So Craig has designed these cut guides to match the offset of your saw, so you can just align the guides with your crosscut line to make your sawing life easier. So we will align our guide, and now you can see I've got the crosscut guide cut line indicator right on the inside of my line because I'll be cutting on the outside of it. Perfect. Pretty slick. So now that we have our first big cut done, we can work on a smaller sheet of plywood, which is a little bit more manageable. And we also know that this is our cut line and this is our reference edge. So this corner is our square corner, and that is where we should be. It's pretty good, doing the rest of our layout from. So the first thing we're going to do is cut this down into two 18-inch sides, 18 inches deep, and then we'll have a little bit of waste left over. So just like on the larger sheet of plywood, I'm going to measure over. Got my 18-inch mark here. I'm going to draw myself a reference line. And I'm just going to use a straight edge to extend my line. Perfect. And then, just like with the larger sheet of plywood, we use the crosscut guide, straight edge guide here. And then we can use this guy as our template to cut the next side. And then for this one, if we were to use our guide like this, we'd actually cut the side a little bit too short because the blade is cutting on this side of the line. So flip this around. So position our guide, and we'll make our next cut. So now we've got our two cabinet sides done. Got a little bit of scrap that we'll use later. And then we just need to cut out a piece for our cabinet bottom. So now we're going to cut out the bottom of the cabinet. That's also going to be 18 inches deep and about 24 inches wide. So we'll measure 18 inches in from our reference edge here, where we broke the sheet down in half before. And this was our back edge. We'll use our straight cutting guide. Line it up on our two cut lines, and we'll make another cut. And then the last thing we need to do is to cut this to width for the bottom of our cabinet. So we've got our cabinet sides and cabinet bottom cut out, and then we're going to use some of these scrap pieces of plywood as filler strips. So we're going to cut 2 for the top and 2 for the back. So we're going to be using the Craig portable crosscut. They have an offset for your cut line, so you can set it up, make your cut, retract it out of the way, and then just zoom right through the wood. Now, if we were just doing a couple of these, that would be a great way to do this. But because we're cutting 4 pieces and we want them to be accurate, we're actually going to use a slightly different tool, and that is the Craig crosscut station. Now, if you don't own a miter saw or a sliding miter saw, this is actually a really great tool for your shop. Basically, it turns your circular saw into a super accurate, repeatable way to make crosscuts. And actually, you can crosscut something up to 12 inches in depth, which is bigger than a lot of miter saws can do on their own. So the crosscut station is really a pretty interesting piece of engineering here. As you can see, you've got your zero clearance plate here, so you know exactly where your circular saw is going to be cutting. It's got a couple of built-in clamps. It also has an angle gauge for cutting miters. And then finally, it has these outrigger supports on both sides for supporting your stock when you're cutting it. And so we'll just slide our first filler strip in there, get it aligned with our cut line, see here. And then all we need to do is cut. But before we do that, I also need to lower my blade here because this is a set height from the top. And so we want to make sure we'll be able to cut all the way through. That looks good. And we'll make our cut. Easy, easy. So I'll just cut some more filler strips and then we can put our cabinet together. There we have it. A simple shop cabinet that we built just with a circular saw, obviously a drill and a driver and some pocket holes, and then these handy cutting accessories from Craig. I'm Andrew with Popular Woodworking. Thanks for watching.